The encounter. It was a warm afternoon, and Senator Kamala Hayes had just finished a comforting lunch with her mother, a tradition she upheld every week. No matter how busy her schedule was, she always made time for these visits, a reminder of where she came from and the values instilled in her since childhood. Kamala, a state senator for District 12, had worked hard to earn her position, fighting tirelessly for social justice, equal rights, and opportunities for all. Though her responsibilities were demanding, she cherished her ability to make a positive difference in the community. After saying goodbye to her mother, Kamala decided to stop by the local mall on her way home to pick up a few essentials. She enjoyed these solo trips, where she could blend into the crowd, take a break from her public duties, and simply exist as just another person navigating life. She carried herself with a calm grace, her head held high, reflecting both confidence and humility. As she parked her car in the crowded lot and stepped out, she felt the warmth of the sun and took a moment to appreciate the peaceful simplicity of the day. With a small shopping list in hand, she entered the mall, browsed the aisles, and carefully selected her items. It was a simple, mundane task, but one that brought her a sense of normalcy. After about half an hour, she exited the mall, balancing her grocery bags and her purse, and made her way back to her car. As she walked through the parking lot, she noticed a police cruiser pulling in behind her vehicle. A quick glance revealed a female police officer inside, her gaze fixed intently on Kamala. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, and her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her posture that set Kamala on edge. The officer, Janice Salazar, was a veteran on the force, known among her peers for her stern demeanor and unyielding attitude. She had a reputation for being strict and uncompromising, traits that often served her well in her line of work. However, there was another side to Janice that wasn't discussed openly, a side that harbored biases and assumptions she sometimes acted upon without a second thought. As Janice watched Kamala, something about the well-dressed woman holding grocery bags didn't sit right with her. Kamala's polished appearance, her calm demeanor, and her composed expression all seemed to annoy her. Janice's instincts, however flawed, kicked in, and she convinced herself that something was suspicious. Without fully understanding why, she decided to act on her impulse. She parked her cruiser a few feet away and stepped out, her expression hardening as she approached Kamala. Her hand rested on her belt, a subtle show of authority, as she walked toward the unsuspecting woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," Janice called out in a firm tone, her voice carrying a hint of accusation. The suddenness of it made Kamala stop in her tracks, her eyes widening slightly as she turned to face the officer. Janice's posture was stiff, her gaze sharp as she scrutinized every detail about Kamala, from her clothing to her groceries. Kamala's first instinct was confusion, quickly followed by composure. She was accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace, and this would be no different. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice calm and respectful. "Is there a problem?" Janice didn't respond immediately. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, as if trying to read between the lines of an imaginary story. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a routine question, but to Kamala, it felt like an accusation. Kamala took a steady breath, maintaining her poise. "I just finished shopping," she replied, gesturing to the bags in her hands. "I'm heading back to my car now." The answer was simple, straightforward, and entirely true, yet Janice's expression didn't soften. Instead, her gaze grew even colder, her posture rigid with an authority that bordered on intimidation. "Can I see some ID?" she demanded, her fingers tapping impatiently on her belt. Kamala felt a jolt of frustration, but managed to keep it hidden behind a polite smile. She was familiar with encounters like this, moments when her presence seemed to elicit unwarranted suspicion. Despite her position as a state senator, she knew all too well that appearances often led to assumptions. "Is there a specific reason you need to see my ID, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but respectful. She wanted to understand the justification behind this treatment, though deep down, she suspected she already knew. Janice's expression hardened, her gaze turning almost defiant. "Just show me your ID, and I'll decide that," she snapped, her tone sharp and unyielding. With a resigned sigh, Camilla carefully set down her bags and reached into her purse, pulling out her wallet. She retrieved her driver's license and handed it over, watching as Janice took it with a smirk, as if she had just caught someone red-handed. Janice looked at the ID, her eyes narrowing as she read the name aloud, almost mockingly. "Senator Kamala Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Never heard of you." Camilla kept her smile, though her patience was wearing thin. "I represent District 12 in the state Senate," she replied calmly. "I work in public service." To Camilla's dismay, Janice's expression didn't change. Instead, the officer pocketed the ID, treating it as though it were a piece of evidence rather than identification. "I don't care who you are, Senator," she retorted, dismissively. "Something doesn't feel right about you being here." Camilla's eyes widened slightly, disbelief washing over her. This was a public parking lot in a mall she frequented regularly, a place where she had every right to be. "Officer, this is a public space. I have every right to be here, just like anyone else," she replied, her voice laced with an edge of disbelief. But Janice wasn't listening. Instead, she folded her arms and blocked Camilla's path, her expression set with a stubborn determination. "You can explain that at the station," she declared, her voice sharp with authority. "I'm taking you in." Camilla felt a surge of indignation, but she knew that arguing further would likely escalate the situation. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had nothing to hide, and she knew her rights. Yet the feeling of helplessness gnawed at her as Janice took her by the arm and led her to the cruiser. Despite her protests, the officer was unyielding, her grip firm as she guided Camilla to the back seat. As they drove to the station, the atmosphere in the cruiser was tense. Janice kept her eyes fixed on the road, her jaw clenched, while Camilla sat silently in the back, trying to steady her breathing. She felt a knot of anxiety building in her chest, mingled with a deep sense of injustice. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, detained by an officer who had clearly made a snap judgment about her. When they arrived at the station, Janice led Camilla inside, her grip still firm on Camilla's arm. They passed rows of officers and detectives, many of whom turned their heads in surprise as they recognized the senator. Whispers quickly spread among the staff, murmurs of confusion and disbelief echoing through the station. "Isn't that Senator Hayes?" one officer whispered to another, his eyes widening in shock. "Why is she in handcuffs?" Janice ignored the stares and murmurs, directing Camilla to a small interrogation room at the back of the station. She opened the door and gestured for Camilla to enter, her expression smug. "Wait here," she ordered, slamming the door shut behind her. Camilla sat down at the metal table, her mind racing. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the room matched the chill she felt inside, a stark reminder of how vulnerable even a respected public official could be in the face of unchecked bias. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited alone, her thoughts filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. This encounter was supposed to have been a routine stop at the mall, a simple errand to cap off her visit with her mother. Instead, it had spiraled into a situation she would never have anticipated, a moment that tested her patience, her composure, and her resilience. Finally, the door creaked open, and a tall man entered the room, his expression both stern and compassionate. He extended a hand, introducing himself as Lieutenant Jordan Pierce. His voice was respectful, his demeanor professional, and for the first time since the encounter had begun, Camilla felt a flicker of hope. "Senator Hayes," he greeted her warmly, a hint of apology in his eyes. "I'm Lieutenant Pierce. I understand there's been a situation here." Camilla shook his hand, grateful for the first sign of respect she'd received since the ordeal began. She composed herself, meeting his gaze with a calm but determined expression. "Lieutenant, thank you for coming. I'd like to know why I was detained and treated as a suspect," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of tension beneath her words. Pierce frowned, flipping through the sparse report that Janice had filled out. He glanced up, clearly puzzled by the lack of evidence or probable cause. His expression grew colder as he processed what had happened, a look of displeasure settling over his face. "Officer Salazar," he said, his voice sharp as he turned to face the door, "do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Janice's face as she stepped into the room, her usual confidence faltering. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her irritation. Lieutenant Pierce's gaze hardened, his tone cold. "This is Senator Kamala Hayes, one of the most respected leaders in our state." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. And as Janice stood there, speechless and visibly shaken, the full implications of her actions began to dawn on her. A long wait for justice. Kamila sat in the sterile, dim interrogation room, trying to steady her emotions. She had dealt with many difficult situations in her career. Debates on the Senate floor, protesters outside her office, intense confrontations with political opponents. But this was different. This was personal. The cold metal of the chair beneath her was a far cry from the polished Senate floor, and the harsh fluorescent lighting above her seemed to mock the dignified life she built through years of hard work and determination. Despite the calm she projected, Kamila's mind raced. She kept replaying the encounter in the parking lot, the way Officer Salazar's gaze had scrutinized her, as if she were nothing more than a suspicious figure. The officer hadn't asked her a single question about her purpose for being at the mall, hadn't bothered to consider any context. She had simply seen Kamila, made a snap judgment, and acted on it. It was the same kind of prejudice that Kamila had spent her career fighting against, a battle she thought was confined to policies, bills, and legislative debates. But here it was, staring her down in the form of a single police officer's actions. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened and Lieutenant Pierce stepped back into the room, his face a mixture of sympathy and concern. He had spent the past several minutes investigating the situation, speaking with other officers, and reviewing the report, if it could even be called that filed by Officer Salazar. Kamila could tell that Pierce was a man who valued professionalism, and his current frustration with the situation was evident. "Senator Hayes," he began, taking a seat across from her, "I want to apologize on behalf of the department. This should never have happened, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it's addressed appropriately." Kamila took a deep breath, grateful for his words, but still feeling the sting of what had occurred. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she replied calmly. "I appreciate that, but I'd like to understand why I was detained in the first place. Officer Salazar didn't give me any reason other than a vague suspicion." Pierce nodded, his expression darkening as he glanced at the report again. "From what I've gathered, Officer Salazar claimed that you appeared suspicious and acted on what she called her instincts. However, there's no substantial basis for her actions, and nothing in her report justifies an arrest." He hesitated, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "Senator, I want to assure you that this is not standard procedure. Officer Salazar has a reputation for making judgment calls that are, let's say, not always in line with protocol." Kamila raised an eyebrow, understanding the subtext. "A reputation, you say?" Pierce sighed, folding his hands in front of him. "Yes, there have been a few complaints in the past, mostly minor incidents, nothing that's led to formal disciplinary action. But I think it's safe to say that today's incident crossed a line." He looked her in the eye, his tone firm. "I want you to know that you have every right to file a formal complaint. In fact, I encourage it." Kamila considered his words carefully. Filing a complaint would mean that she'd have to relive this experience, put it on the public record, and potentially face media scrutiny. As a senator, she knew how things like this could spiral in the public eye. But as she thought about it, she realized that this wasn't just about her. Officer Salazar's actions reflected a deeper problem, one that countless people faced every day, people who didn't have the platform she did. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit in allowing this behavior to continue unchecked. "Lieutenant Pierce," she said thoughtfully, "I'll consider it. This isn't about vengeance. It's about accountability and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Pierce nodded in understanding. "I respect that, Senator. I'll have an official statement prepared, and you'll be released immediately. I just need to handle a few procedural matters first. Please, make yourself comfortable, if that's even possible in here." He gave her a small, apologetic smile before standing and exiting the room once again. Candela leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the decision she was about to make, the impact it could have on her life and career. But more than that, she felt the responsibility she held toward those who looked up to her as a voice of justice and equality. Outside the interrogation room, the atmosphere in the police station had shifted. Whispers had spread among the officers, and the tension was palpable. Officers glanced at each other, some with expressions of disbelief, others with clear disapproval of Janice's actions. This was not the kind of publicity their precinct needed, and they all knew it. Officer Janice Salazar, however, sat at her desk, her jaw clenched in frustration. She had heard bits and pieces of the conversations around her, the shock at her detainment of a state senator. Yet instead of feeling remorse, she was irritated. In her mind, she had simply done her job. Her instincts had told her that Camilla was suspicious, and she had acted on them. She didn't see why her judgment was suddenly under fire. But as Lieutenant Pierce approached her desk, his expression grim, she knew that her actions would not be overlooked. He stopped in front of her, crossing his arms as he looked down at her with disappointment and a touch of anger. "Officer Salazar, a word," he said, his voice cold and clipped. She stood, her posture defensive, but she followed him to a quieter corner of the station where they could speak privately. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, I was just doing my job. I acted on a hunch. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" Pierce's eyes narrowed. "No, Officer Salazar. What you did was detain a respected public official without cause, without any reasonable suspicion, and frankly, without a shred of respect. This is not how we conduct ourselves in this department." Janice opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand to silence her. "This isn't the first time, either. I've overlooked your questionable calls in the past, but today you crossed a line. Senator Hayes is considering filing a formal complaint, and I assure you, if she does, I will fully support her." Janice felt a surge of anger and humiliation, but kept her face neutral. She knew better than to argue with her superior in front of the entire station. Instead, she nodded stiffly, biting back her retort. Pierce continued, his voice low but firm. "Consider this your warning. You're on thin ice, officer. I suggest you take a hard look at how you're approaching your duties, because if this happens again, you won't just be facing a suspension. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Lieutenant," she replied through gritted teeth, her hands clenched at her sides. He held her gaze for a moment longer before turning and walking away, leaving Janice standing alone, simmering with resentment and humiliation. She felt the stares of her colleagues, their judgment as palpable as the tension in the air. She knew that her reputation was tarnished, and it stung her deeply. But instead of feeling remorse, she felt only bitterness. In her mind, she was the victim of an overreaction, a situation blown out of proportion by politics and favoritism. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Pierce returned to the interrogation room, where Camilla was waiting. He opened the door, giving her a reassuring nod. "Senator Hayes, everything has been sorted out. You're free to go. I apologize again for the way you were treated. It's not reflective of our department's values, and I assure you steps will be taken to prevent this from happening again." Camilla rose from her seat, maintaining her composed demeanor. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your professionalism and the way you've handled this." As they walked toward the exit, Pierce offered her a sympathetic smile. If there's anything further you need, or if you decide to file a complaint, please don't hesitate to reach out. And know that you have our support." Camilla nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities, the ramifications of filing a complaint, and bringing attention to what had happened. Outside the station, she was greeted by the brisk afternoon air, a reminder of the world beyond the four cold walls she had just left. As she walked to her car, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a text from her aide, who had clearly heard about the incident. "Are you okay? I heard what happened. Do you need me to handle anything?" Camilla took a deep breath before typing her response. "I'm fine. Let's talk tomorrow. I'll need to address this carefully." She knew that her next steps would be crucial. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was an opportunity to bring attention to a larger issue, a systemic problem that affected so many who didn't have the platform or privilege she held. She couldn't ignore what had happened, but she also needed to proceed with care, to use her voice thoughtfully. As she started her car and drove away from the station, Camilla felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience had been painful and humiliating, but it had also given her a window into the lives of those who faced such discrimination regularly. She was reminded of why she had entered public service in the first place: to fight for justice, to challenge biases, and to create a society where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. That night, as she sat in her living room, Camilla reflected on the steps she would take. She didn't want revenge against Officer Salazar, but she wanted accountability. More than anything, she wanted to spark a conversation, to encourage change within the system. She knew that would take time, patience, and resilience, but she was ready. For this was more than a single incident. It was a call to action, a reminder that her work was far from over. The aftermath and the decision. The next morning, Camilla woke up early, her mind already buzzing with thoughts of the previous day's events. She couldn't shake the memory of Officer Salazar's harsh gaze, the unwarranted suspicion in her voice, and the uncomfortable feeling of being treated like a criminal for doing something as mundane as shopping. The ordeal had left a mark, one that wouldn't easily fade. But more than the personal indignity, it was the thought of others facing similar treatment, without her resources or platform, that disturbed her the most. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, and even a few local journalists. Word of her detainment had started to spread. A few people were curious, while others were outraged on her behalf. Her aide, Maria, had already left her 3 messages, each more urgent than the last, asking if she planned to make a public statement. Camilla glanced over the messages, but she didn't respond right away. This wasn't something she wanted to rush. She needed to think through her response, consider the potential repercussions, and weigh her options carefully. As she prepared for her day, Camilla's thoughts drifted back to the countless faces she'd met throughout her career. Individuals who had come to her with their stories of discrimination and mistreatment. She had always felt empathy for them, but now, that empathy had deepened into something more personal. She had experienced a glimpse of their reality firsthand, and it had left her with a renewed sense of responsibility. By mid-morning, she arrived at her office and was immediately greeted by Maria, a young, energetic woman with a keen sense of justice and a knack for organization. Maria's eyes were filled with concern as she handed Camilla a cup of tea. "Senator Hayes," Maria began, her voice soft but urgent, "I'm so sorry for what happened yesterday. It's unbelievable. How are you feeling?" Camilla managed a small smile. "Thank you, Maria. I'm fine. Just reflective." It was a reminder of the work we still need to do. Maria nodded, her brow furrowing. "A few reporters have reached out, wanting a comment. I didn't say anything yet. I thought it was best to wait for your decision. But honestly, people are outraged. They're ready to rally behind you." Camilla appreciated Maria's passion, but she knew this wasn't a decision she could take lightly. "I want to address this, Maria. I need to. But I don't want this to be about revenge or anger. I want it to be about change, about raising awareness of a problem that goes beyond just one incident. Maria listened intently, her respect for Camilla evident in her expression. "So, what are you thinking? A press conference? A written statement?" Camilla considered this. "I think I'll start with a public statement, something thoughtful that addresses what happened and why it matters. I want to use my platform to shed light on this issue, but I also want to be careful not to demonize the entire police force. There are good officers out there, people like Lieutenant Pierce, who handled the situation with respect and professionalism. This isn't about painting all officers with the same brush." Maria nodded, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "I understand. I'll get started on a draft and pull in some statistics about racial profiling and discrimination for context." Camilla thanked her, feeling grateful for Maria's dedication. As Maria left the room, Camilla took a moment to reflect. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was an unexpected call from an old friend, Reverend Marcus Lawson, a prominent civil rights leader and activist. They had collaborated on several initiatives before, but it had been a while since they'd spoken. "Reverend Lawson," she greeted warmly, "it's good to hear from you." "Camilla," he replied, his deep voice filled with warmth and familiarity. "I heard about what happened. Are you all right?" "Yes," she replied, grateful for his concern. "It was unsettling, but I'm fine. Just trying to decide the best way to handle this." There was a pause on the other end. Then Reverend Lawson spoke thoughtfully. "You know, Camilla, I've always believed that incidents like this, as painful as they are, have the power to ignite change. You're in a unique position. You have a platform and the respect of your community. People look up to you. If you decide to speak out, you'll be amplifying the voices of those who've been silenced or ignored." Camilla took in his words, feeling the weight of his message settle over her. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not just about me. This is about everyone who's experienced prejudice and felt powerless to fight back." "I know you'll do what's right," Reverend Lawson replied, his voice filled with confidence. "And if you need support, you know I'm here." They ended the call, and Camilla felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her resolve strengthened as she thought about what she wanted to say. She decided to address not just her own experience, but also the broader issue of racial profiling and the importance of accountability. The statement came together over the course of the day. With Maria's help, Camilla crafted a message that was both powerful and measured. She recounted the events factually, without embellishment, and explained why this experience, while personal, was part of a much larger problem. She called for reforms within law enforcement to address implicit biases, urging the public to recognize that such incidents were not isolated, but part of a systemic issue. By evening, the statement was ready. Camilla decided to share it on her official social media accounts and through a press release. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage, others offering support and sharing their own stories of similar experiences. Her statement quickly gained traction, and within hours, it was being shared widely across various platforms. The story attracted the attention of local media, and soon national outlets began to pick it up. The next day, Camilla's phone rang non-stop with requests for interviews and statements. Reporters wanted to hear directly from her, and many offered her a platform to speak out about the issue of racial profiling and police accountability. Camilla accepted a few of these requests, choosing reputable outlets where she knew the conversation would be handled respectfully and thoughtfully. Each interview was an opportunity to highlight the broader issues at hand, to advocate for change, and to share the stories of countless individuals who had faced similar treatment without the privilege of her platform. As the week went on, Camilla noticed a surprising shift in the public discourse. Her statement had struck a chord, and conversations about racial profiling and law enforcement reform were happening in spaces that had previously avoided such topics. Even within the police department, there was growing tension. Camilla learned that several officers had voiced their concerns about Officer Salazar's behavior, and a few even reached out to her privately to offer their support. In the meantime, Kamala received a call from Lieutenant Pierce. She appreciated his professionalism during the incident, and his actions had given her hope that there were people within law enforcement who understood the importance of accountability. Senator Hayes, Pierce greeted her warmly. "I just wanted to reach out and let you know that your statement made an impact here. A lot of us. Well, we're having some hard conversations. People are reevaluating their own actions, and I think, in the long run, this will lead to real change." Camila felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'm glad to hear that. I want to see a world where we can trust those who protect and serve, where everyone is treated with respect and dignity." "I couldn't agree more," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "Officer Salazar's actions don't reflect our department's values. An investigation is already underway, and I believe she'll face appropriate disciplinary action. We're committed to doing better." The call left Camila feeling hopeful. For the first time since the incident, she felt that her actions were leading to meaningful change. The police department was taking steps to address the issue, and conversations about racial bias were happening across the community. The momentum continued to build. Community leaders and activists organized a forum on racial bias and police reform, inviting Camila to speak alongside other local advocates. The forum attracted a large crowd, filling the auditorium with people from all walks of life: students, community members, activists, and even law enforcement officers. They were united by a common purpose: to find solutions, to bridge divides, and to create a more just society. At the forum, Camila spoke passionately about her experience and the need for systemic change. She called for accountability, for better training programs that addressed implicit bias, and for stronger community police relations. Her words were met with applause, but more importantly, they sparked discussions that continued long after the event ended. After the forum, a young woman approached Camila, her eyes filled with admiration. "Senator Hayes," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "thank you for speaking out. I went through something similar last year, but I didn't know how to fight back. Seeing you stand up, it gives me hope." Camila smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "You're not alone. We're in this together, and together, we can make a difference." As she left the forum that night, Camila felt a profound sense of purpose. The incident with Officer Salazar had been painful and unjust, but it had also been a catalyst, a call to action that she couldn't ignore. She was determined to continue the fight, to use her voice not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated. And so, with each step forward, Camila knew that her journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that she would champion with unwavering resolve, fueled by the belief that justice was not just a dream, but a goal worth fighting for. Rising tides and new allies. As the days turned into weeks, Camila's stand against racial profiling and police misconduct continued to make waves across the state. Her story had resonated with people from all walks of life: parents, students, community leaders, and even other public officials. She became a figurehead in a conversation that had been long overdue, a spark igniting the fuel that had been building up for years. And with that came both support and opposition. One morning, as she was preparing to head to the office, Camila received an unexpected call from Senator Benjamin Carter, a prominent figure in the state's legislature and a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform. Senator Carter was known for his dedication to fighting for equality and fair treatment, and he had a reputation for being both fearless and outspoken. He was an influential voice, and his support could make a significant difference. "Senator Hayes," Carter greeted her warmly, his voice calm but filled with enthusiasm. "I wanted to reach out and commend you on the stand you're taking. What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone, and your courage to speak out has inspired many, including myself." "Thank you, Senator Carter," Camila replied, a smile spreading across her face. "It's been a challenging journey, but I believe that change is possible, especially with the support of people like you." They spoke at length, discussing the impact of her statement and the response it had garnered from the community. Carter shared his own experiences working in criminal justice reform, and together they'd brainstormed potential initiatives that could bring about real, lasting change. "Listen, Camilla," Carter said finally, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. "I think we have an opportunity here. This incident has put a spotlight on issues that have been ignored for too long. I'd like to propose a bipartisan task force on police reform and accountability, with you as one of the key members. We can bring together policymakers, community leaders, and law enforcement representatives to address these issues head-on." Camila felt a surge of hope and determination. "That sounds exactly like what we need," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm in. Let's do this." They spoke at length, discussing the impact of her statement and the response it had garnered from the community. Carter shared his own experiences working in criminal justice reform, and together they brainstormed potential initiatives that could bring about real, lasting change. "Listen, Camilla," Carter said finally, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. "I think we have an opportunity here. This incident has put a spotlight on issues that have been ignored for too long. I'd like to propose a bipartisan task force on police reform and accountability, with you as one of the key members. We can bring together policymakers, community leaders, and law enforcement representatives to address these issues head-on." Camila felt a surge of hope and determination. "That sounds exactly like what we need," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm in. Let's do this." The task force was quickly established, and Camila threw herself into the work. The group met regularly, conducting in-depth discussions on topics such as implicit bias training, the role of law enforcement in communities, and the need for transparency and accountability within police departments. Camila was instrumental in bringing community voices to the table, ensuring that the task force was inclusive and representative of the people it sought to serve. As the task force's work gained momentum, Camila's visibility continued to grow. She received invitations to speak at events across the state, addressing audiences eager to hear her insights on justice and reform. She was particularly moved when she received a request from Lincoln High School, an inner-city school with a diverse student body. The school's principal, Mr. Evans, had written to her, explaining that her story had resonated deeply with his students and that they would be honored to have her speak. The day of the visit, Camila arrived at the school to a warm welcome. She was greeted by Mr. Evans, a tall, kind-looking man in his 40s who led her through the bustling hallways. Students peeked out from their classrooms, some whispering excitedly, others waving shyly as she passed. In the auditorium, hundreds of students had gathered, filling the seats with an air of anticipation. Camila stepped onto the stage, feeling a swell of pride as she looked out at the sea of young faces, students of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and life experiences, all united in their curiosity and eagerness to learn. She began her speech by recounting the story of her detainment, but she focused less on the details and more on the lessons she had taken from the experience. She spoke about resilience, about the power of speaking out against injustice, and about the importance of community. "I know some of you have faced challenges," she said, her voice warm and steady. "And I know that sometimes it feels like the world is stacked against you. But I want you to know that you have a voice. You have power. And when you stand up for what's right, you make it easier for others to do the same." The students listened intently, their eyes fixed on her as she spoke. She could see a mix of emotions in their expressions: hope, inspiration, and determination. She finished her speech with a call to action, encouraging them to be the change they wanted to see in the world. As she stepped off the stage, she was greeted with applause and cheers. Several students approached her, each one eager to share their thoughts and ask questions. One young woman, with a shy but determined demeanor, introduced herself as Maya and spoke about her dream of becoming a lawyer to fight for justice. "Senator Hayes, you've inspired me," Maya said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I want to make a difference, just like you." Camila smiled, placing a hand on Maya's shoulder. "I have no doubt that you'll do great things, Maya. Remember, the journey isn't always easy, but it's worth it. And if you ever need guidance, I'm here." The school visit stayed with Camila long after she left. She could feel the weight of her responsibility growing, but she welcomed it. The conversation she'd had with those students, the hope and ambition she saw in their eyes. It all fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, the task force was making progress. They conducted town hall meetings, gathering input from citizens, activists, and law enforcement officers alike. Camila was often the face of these events, her voice steady as she navigated tense conversations and emotional testimonies. Not everyone was receptive to the reforms. At one town hall meeting, a retired officer named Tom Jensen stood up, his face etched with frustration. "I've served this community for over 30 years, he said, his voice loud and unyielding. "I understand that there are issues that need to be addressed, but I'm tired of seeing all police officers painted with the same brush. We're here to protect and serve." Camila met his gaze, her expression calm. "Mr. Jensen, I appreciate your service, and I understand your concerns. The last thing we want is to undermine the hard work of good officers. This task force isn't about vilifying law enforcement. It's about ensuring that all citizens feel safe and respected. Accountability isn't the enemy of good policing. It's what builds trust." Her response seemed to resonate with many in the audience, and after the meeting, several officers approached her to thank her for her balanced approach. They expressed their support for the reforms, acknowledging that change was needed for the sake of the community and the integrity of the profession. But not everyone was willing to listen. Officer Janice Salazar's suspension had sparked its own controversy within the police department. Some of her colleagues viewed her suspension as justified, a necessary response to her actions. Others, however, rallied behind her, claiming that she was being unfairly punished. Camila was aware of this tension, and while she didn't want to escalate the situation, she knew that Officer Salazar's case was a pivotal moment. It represented a line in the sand, a statement that prejudice and misconduct would not be tolerated. One evening, as she was reviewing task force documents in her office, she received a message from Lieutenant Pierce. He had been monitoring the situation closely, and he wanted to update her on the internal investigation into Officer Salazar's actions. "Senator Hayes," he wrote, "I thought you'd like to know that Officer Salazar's case is moving forward. The department is taking the matter seriously, and there's a strong likelihood that she will face disciplinary action. It's been a difficult process, but I believe that your stand has made a difference." Camila felt a sense of relief, tempered with a recognition of the challenges ahead. She knew that real change took time, that it required persistence and resilience. But with each step, she could see the impact of her efforts, the slow but steady shift in attitudes and policies. The pressure and scrutiny were unrelenting, and there were days when she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Yet, she remained resolute, drawing strength from the community that had rallied behind her, from the students she had inspired, and from allies like Senator Carter and Lieutenant Pierce who stood beside her. One night, as she sat in her living room, reflecting on the journey thus far, she thought back to her initial encounter with Officer Salazar. She realized that, in a way, that painful experience had been a catalyst, pushing her to confront issues she had long advocated for, but never fully experienced on a personal level. This was her purpose, her calling. She was more than a senator. She was a representative of those who had been silenced, marginalized, and ignored. And she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than. As she looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and determination. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for the journey ahead, a rally for change. The news of Camila's efforts and her role in the task force had spread far and wide. Her story had become a beacon of hope for many who had experienced similar injustice, and her unwavering dedication to reform was inspiring a movement. Camila's days were filled with meetings, town halls, and interviews, each one adding fuel to the fire of change she had ignited. But she knew that public support wasn't enough. Real progress required institutional commitment, and she was determined to bring that to fruition. One morning, as she sat in her office reviewing emails, Maria walked in with a stack of letters. Candela looked up, raising an eyebrow at the large pile. "More letters?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. Maria nodded, her expression a mix of pride and disbelief. "Yes, and they're not slowing down. People from all over the state, and even some from out of state, are writing in to share their stories and express their support. They're thanking you for standing up and asking for change." Camila reached for one of the letters, unfolding it carefully. As she read, her heart swelled with emotion. This letter was from a mother in a small town who wrote about her teenage son being racially profiled by the police. The woman spoke of the humiliation and fear her son felt, and how she had felt powerless to protect him. But she ended the letter with a glimmer of hope, thanking Camila for making her feel heard and for giving families like hers a voice. Candela's eyes misted over as she read the letter. Each story she received was a reminder of the lives that her work touched, of the countless people who had suffered in silence. She looked up at Maria, who was watching her with a knowing smile. "These letters mean so much," Candela said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It's one thing to fight for change on a policy level, but knowing that real people's lives are impacted, it makes it all so much more meaningful." Maria nodded. "It's incredible, Senator. You're making a real difference. But there's something else." She leaned in, her expression turning serious. "There's been a request for you to speak at a rally in the city center. It's being organized by several community groups, and they're hoping you'll be the keynote speaker. They want to make a statement to show that the community is united in support of reform." Candela's mind raced. The idea of speaking at a rally was both exciting and daunting. It would mean putting herself out there even more, standing before a large crowd and addressing the public directly. But she knew she couldn't pass up the opportunity to connect with the people who had been supporting her. If the community was coming together to demand change, she wanted to be right there with them. "Tell them I'll be there," Camila replied, her voice resolute. "If they're willing to stand up for this cause, then I'll stand with them." The day of the rally arrived quickly, and Camila prepared herself with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She dressed simply, choosing a comfortable but professional outfit, and as she looked in the mirror, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about justice, about giving people a voice, and creating a better future for everyone. As she arrived at the city center, she was taken aback by the sheer size of the crowd. Hundreds, maybe even thousands, of people had gathered, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling Now." The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of unity and purpose that was palpable. Candela took a moment to take it all in, her heart swelling with pride and humility. She was approached by Reverend Marcus Lawson, who had helped organize the rally, along with several other community leaders. Reverend Lawson greeted her warmly, his face filled with admiration. "Camila, this is incredible," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "People have been waiting for a leader like you, someone who's willing to stand up and fight for them. You've inspired all of this." Camila shook her head, smiling humbly. "This isn't about me, Reverend. It's about all of us. Every person here is part of this movement, and together, we can make a difference." As the rally began, various speakers took to the stage, sharing their stories and calling for justice. "I believe in us," she said, her voice carrying a message of hope. "I believe in our ability to create change. I believe that together, we can make this world a better place, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. And I want you all to know that I'm with you, every step of the way. I will fight with you for justice, for equality, for a brighter future." As she finished, the crowd's response was overwhelming. People were cheering, some wiping away tears, others waving their signs with renewed vigor. The energy was electric, and in that moment, Kamala knew that they were on the brink of something transformative. After her speech, Kamala mingled with the crowd, shaking hands, hugging supporters, and listening to their stories. People of all ages and backgrounds approached her, expressing their gratitude and sharing their own experiences. Many of them were just grateful to feel seen, to know that someone was fighting for them on a larger stage. Amid the crowd, a young woman named Lydia approached her, clutching a sign that read, "Justice for All." Lydia was visibly emotional, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Senator Hayes, I just wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I've lived my whole life feeling like my voice didn't matter, like no one cared about people like me. But seeing you stand up, seeing you fight, it makes me believe that maybe things can really change." Camila placed a reassuring hand on Lydia's shoulder. "Your voice does matter, Lydia. You matter. And as long as I'm here, I'll keep fighting to make sure everyone knows that." They shared a moment of silent understanding, a bond forged in their shared commitment to justice. As the rally wound down, Candela felt a profound sense of purpose settle within her. This was more than just a cause. It was a movement, one that was growing stronger with each passing day. And as she looked around at the crowd of passionate, determined individuals, she knew that she was part of something much larger than herself. The momentum from the rally continued to build in the days that followed. News outlets covered the event, sharing footage of Camila's speech and the powerful testimonies from other speakers. People across the state, and even beyond, were inspired by the rally's message, and support for the task force's initiatives grew. Meanwhile, the task force itself was making significant strides. Kamala and Senator Carter worked tirelessly to draft new legislation that would address issues of racial profiling, implicit bias, and police accountability. The proposed reforms included mandatory training for law enforcement, increased transparency, and a stronger system for reporting and investigating complaints. The opposition was fierce, of course. Some political leaders and law enforcement officials resisted the changes, arguing that they would undermine the authority of the police. But Kamala was undeterred. She knew that meaningful change was never easy, and she was prepared to face the challenges head-on. One evening, as she reviewed the latest draft of the legislation, she received a call from Lieutenant Pierce. He had been a steadfast ally throughout the process, and his support had been invaluable. "Senator Hayes," he said, his voice warm, "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of the work you're doing. I know it hasn't been easy, but you're making a real difference." Camila smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I couldn't have done this without allies like you. This fight is bigger than any one of us, but together, I believe we can make a real impact." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing the progress of the task force and the challenges that lay ahead. As they ended the call, Candela felt a renewed sense of determination. This was her purpose, this was her calling, and she would not stop until justice, fairness, and dignity were not just words, but realities for every person in her community. The journey was far from over, but as she looked toward the future, Kamala knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice was long and difficult, but it was a fight worth waging, and she was committed to seeing it through to the end. A legacy of change. As the weeks turned into months, Kamala's efforts began to bear fruit. The rally had been a monumental success, uniting people from different backgrounds and sparking a movement for justice that was now unstoppable. The proposed reforms had gained enough traction to reach the state legislature for a vote. Despite facing staunch opposition, the momentum behind the legislation was undeniable. Candela had become a symbol of hope, not just within her state, but across the nation. Her name was now synonymous with resilience, determination, and justice. In the days leading up to the vote, Kamala worked tirelessly with her team and allies. She met with legislators, community leaders, and citizens who were eager to see the reforms passed. Senator Benjamin Carter and Reverend Marcus Lawson stood firmly by her side, each lending their influence and experience to rally support. The task force had already implemented preliminary recommendations in several districts, where pilot programs on implicit bias training and police community engagement were being tested. The results were promising, and Kamala was more committed than ever to making these changes permanent. One morning, as Kamala prepared for a final meeting with key legislators, she received a call from Lydia, the young woman she'd met at the rally. Lydia had been deeply moved by Kamala's speech and had since become active in her local community, organizing events to raise awareness about racial justice and equality. "Senator Hayes," Lydia began, her voice filled with excitement, "I just wanted to call and thank you. Because of you, I'm going back to school. I've enrolled in a criminal justice program. I want to be part of the solution, to make a difference, just like you." Camila felt a wave of pride and emotion wash over her. "Lydia, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. You're going to change lives, and I have no doubt you'll make an amazing impact." Lydia's words stayed with her throughout the day, reinforcing her resolve. This wasn't just about policy or politics. It was about people. People like Lydia, who had been inspired to take action and fight for a better future. The impact of her work was rippling outward, affecting lives in ways she could never have anticipated. When the day of the vote finally arrived, the state capitol building was filled with an unusual energy. Protesters, supporters, and onlookers gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. Inside, the tension was palpable. Lawmakers filed into the chamber, some looking apprehensive, others resolute. Kamala and Senator Carter exchanged a determined nod, both aware of the significance of the moment. The debate was intense. Opponents of the bill argued that the reforms would undermine the authority of law enforcement and create unnecessary bureaucratic burdens. Supporters countered that accountability and transparency were essential to building trust between the police and the communities they served. Kamala listened carefully to each argument, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. When it was her turn to speak, Kamala took a deep breath and stepped forward. She spoke from the heart, sharing her own experience and the experiences of the countless people who had reached out to her since her detainment. She reminded her colleagues that this was not about punishing law enforcement, but about creating a system that respected the dignity and rights of every citizen. "I stand here today," she said, her voice steady, "not just as a senator, but as a daughter, a mother, and a member of this community. This is about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, can walk down the street, go to the store, or simply exist without fear of discrimination. It's about the kind of world we want to leave for our children." Her words resonated with the chamber, and when she finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by applause from supporters in the gallery. The vote was cast, and after what felt like an eternity, the results were announced. The reform bill had passed. Kamala felt an overwhelming sense of relief and pride as she exchanged hugs and handshakes with her allies. This victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had stood by her side. The passage of the bill was celebrated across the state. Community members, activists, and even law enforcement officers who had supported the reforms joined in the celebrations. Kamala attended a gathering that evening, where Reverend Lawson, Senator Carter, and other leaders addressed the crowd, each expressing their gratitude for the hard work and dedication that had led to this moment. During the celebration, Kamala was approached by Lieutenant Pierce. He had been instrumental in supporting the reforms within the police department, and his efforts had made a real difference. "Senator Hayes," he said, extending his hand, "you did it. You changed the course of history today." Kamala shook his hand, her smile filled with gratitude. "We did it, Lieutenant. This was a team effort, and your support was invaluable. I'm grateful for your courage and commitment to justice." The following week, Kamala received a call from a national news network requesting an interview. Her story had gained national attention, and people across the country were eager to hear from the woman who had stood up to injustice and inspired a movement. She accepted the invitation, knowing that this was an opportunity to reach an even larger audience and to encourage others to take action. In the interview, Camilla spoke about the journey she had been on, the obstacles she had faced, and the importance of standing up for what was right. She spoke of the countless individuals who had shared their stories with her, of Lydia, and the other young people who had been inspired by her actions. She ended with a message of hope and determination, reminding viewers that change was possible, but it required courage, resilience, and a willingness to fight for justice. The interview went viral, and Camilla's story became a symbol of the power of one person's resolve to make a difference. She received messages from people across the country, each one expressing gratitude and admiration for her bravery. Months later, as the reforms began to take effect, Camilla continued to work with the task force, monitoring the progress of the new policies and advocating for additional measures to address inequality and discrimination. She visited schools, community centers, and town halls, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to get involved. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The invitation came with a request for her to lead a panel discussion on racial profiling and police accountability. She accepted, knowing that this was an opportunity to further amplify her message and to inspire others to join the fight. As she stood on the stage of the conference, looking out at the audience, she felt a sense of pride and fulfillment that she had never known before. She had found her purpose, her calling. This was the work she was meant to do, and she was grateful for every step of the journey that had led her here. In her speech, she spoke not only of the challenges she had faced, but also of the triumphs, the moments of unity and hope that had fueled her resolve. She ended with a call to action, urging everyone in the room to take a stand, to use their voices, and to fight for a world where justice and equality were not just ideals, but realities. The audience rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Camilla felt a surge of emotion as she looked out at the crowd, each face reflecting the impact of her words. This was her legacy, a legacy of change, of resilience, of justice, and she knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would continue to fight, to lead, and to inspire. As she left the stage, she was approached by a young girl, no older than 12, who looked up at her with wide, admiring eyes. "Senator Hayes," the girl said shyly, "I want to be just like you when I grow up." Camilla knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. "You can be anything you want to be," she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "And if you believe in yourself and stand up for what's right, you'll make this world a better place." In that moment, Camilla realized that her journey had come full circle. She had started as one voice among many, but she had grown into a leader, a champion for justice. And now, as she inspired the next generation to follow in her footsteps, she knew that her legacy would live on. The fight for justice was far from over, but Camilla Hayes was ready, now and always, to lead the way.